Welcome, everybody, to the middle part of the week. I hope that you guys are hanging in there even as we move through this second week of virtual education. Pretty crazy to think that a week ago we were starting off and kind of having our feet hit the ground. Hopefully, you guys feel like they're still firmly on the ground and we're not slipping too bad. As we started, I'd like you to tell me who the berserkers were and why they were feared as the Vikings began to attack. Who were the berserkers and why were they feared? Well, last time we were talking about the different deities. We talked about Odin and Frey, and of course, what Disney has kind of banked on, the rise of Thor. But I'd like to talk as we begin today about what's going to happen to the Vikings after they die. They believed if they died while fighting, that the Valkyries would carry them to what they imagined heaven to be, which was Valhalla. These daughters of Odin would come and would pick them off the battlefield and carry them to Valhalla. It was there that they imagined that they would spend the rest of their days doing two things that they really enjoyed a lot: fighting and feasting. Fighting and feasting was what they imagined every day would contain. One of the training things that they imagined would happen in Valhalla, they would stick a maiden, they would place a maiden up against a wall. And again, this was not actually happening in Norway or Sweden or anywhere, but they imagined this is what Valhalla would be like. They would put a girl that had long flowing braids up against a wall and would pin her braid to the wall. And then they imagined warriors would come one after another with hatchet in hand and try to cut her braid off closest to her head. Students have asked in the past, well, what would happen if they hit her in the head? I've responded, well, I imagine she would have a splitting headache at that point. Well, enough of that. Well, Viking chieftains specifically would now be placed in these long ships. The video on Monday referenced that, but here's an example in Norway. I hope that you guys are able to one day go to this museum. It is spectacular. I've stood in that room and to see boats that are 1,000 years old, or it's pretty amazing to imagine Vikings being in these boats. They would put everything onto the boat that they would need. You imagine armor, sometimes even servants that would go on there. They would put food and clothing. They didn't know what they might need in Valhalla, and so they wanted to make sure to send their chieftain off with everything that they might need. As you look at it, we're going to see now this being his final resting place, and then two things, or one of two things, would happen. First of all, they would send it into the harbor, and then they would take bow and arrow with the tip of the arrow lit, and they would shoot it at the boat, many times aiming for the sail to now catch that on fire, and the chieftain and these different goods would be burned within the harbor, sending them off to Valhalla. Or at times they would bury the ship with all of these goods on it in the ground as a way of saying goodbye. Either way, they wanted to honor the chieftain and make sure that they sent him off on a good note. About 1000 AD or so, ironically, roughly the time that we talked about Eric the Red's son, Leif Erikson, settling in North America, the Viking fear that had been struck throughout Europe, hopefully you guys enjoyed that video, was now going to start ebbing away. This 200-year window that the Vikings had now dominated is slowly going to now decrease and diminish. I'd like to talk about a few reasons, three of them actually, why that's going to happen. First, as you think about Europe being attacked, they had this mindset where they realized we're constantly afraid of the Vikings. You heard in the video, God save us from those men from the north, those Norsemen. Well, now they've figured out if the Vikings come and attack, this is what we can do to be able to defend ourselves. These are ways that we're going to now be able to fight back, ways to protect our towns and the citizens. These are things that we can do to make sure that people are going to now be preserved. There's also going to be this warming trend that is going to allow more people to stay in Scandinavia. So it goes across Europe, but even extends north into Scandinavia. So whereas some people might have been pushed away from Scandinavia, poor farming conditions, this warming trend is going to allow them to face tougher growing conditions in Europe than they're going to face in Scandinavia. And so many of them will either leave Europe and certainly not be incentivized to come and attack there. There's going to be a push back towards Scandinavia. And finally, there's going to be a number of Vikings that are eventually going to accept Christianity. Hopefully, even as you guys watch the video, you didn't get that question wrong. Some of you maybe did. But as you look at it, initially they weren't interested in Christianity. They had their set beliefs religiously, and Christianity was not on that list. However, as time goes on, they begin to intermarry with those that they're conquering. There's now a push toward Christianity. And if you become a Christian, you imagine one of the first things that you start to kind of process is we can't go kill our fellow brothers in Christ, those that believe the same thing that we do. We're going to now stop fighting. As we think about the Vikings, I think it's important to realize that they are the last major fighting group, the last major barbarian group that's going to be coming into Western Europe. By this point, as we move toward the Middle Ages, you're going to see more and more people hunkering down and saying, we're going to defend what is ours. We're going to now be able to fight back. There really aren't these barbarian tribes anymore. It becomes more of like armies that are going to be fighting each other. We'll be talking about that in the days to come. Well, hopefully this first video is going to wrap up well for you. If you guys, again, we'll be answering some questions. Hopefully they won't be too tough. Have a great afternoon.